The highway stretched ahead, a long, dark ribbon cutting through the empty plains. Jason had been driving for hours, the steady hum of his 18-wheeler a constant companion in the quiet night. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness creeping into his muscles. A glance at the dashboard clock told him it was just past midnight, another 5 hours to go before his next stop. The road was empty except for the occasional distant pair of headlights. It was just him, the truck, and the open highway. Then he saw it. A white van, old, rusted, its paint peeling away in patches. It sat on the shoulder of the road, hazard lights off, no sign of movement inside. Jason barely gave it a second glance as he passed, but something about it made the hairs on his arms rise. A few miles later, he checked his mirrors. The road behind him was dark and empty, nothing but asphalt stretching into the night. Then, out of nowhere, the van was there. Its headlights glowed dimly in the distance, keeping a steady pace behind him. Jason frowned. He hadn't seen it pull onto the road, hadn't seen any lights flick on. It was just there. He shook his head. Long hours on the road could play tricks on the mind. Maybe it had been there all along, and he just hadn't noticed. He reached for his radio, flicking to an open frequency. "Anyone out there?" "This is Highwayman, rolling westbound on 94 static." No response. The van remained in his mirrors, following him. Jason exhaled, adjusting his speed. He wasn't about to let some creepy van get under his skin. Probably just another driver heading the same way. No reason to assume the worst. 10 miles passed, then 20, then 50. The van never changed its position. Jason pushed the truck a little faster, watching the van shrink in the distance. He kept his eyes on the road, counting the seconds before it disappeared from view. 1, 2, 3. He blinked. The van was there, right behind him. It hadn't sped up, hadn't moved lanes. It was just suddenly closer, as if the miles between them had never existed. A cold sensation crawled up Jason's spine. He tapped the brakes, just lightly, to see if the van would react. Nothing. It maintained its position. His fingers drummed against the wheel. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the other driver was messing with him. Or maybe something was very, very wrong. He checked the GPS. Still on track. No turns for another 30 miles. His hands tightened around the wheel. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Let's see if you're really there." He flipped his turn signal, changing lanes. The van didn't follow. For a moment, relief flickered through him. Maybe it really was just another driver. Then the van's headlights flickered and it was back. Not merging, not accelerating. Just there. Jason's breath caught. His pulse pounded in his ears. He flipped the radio back on. "Breaker, breaker. Anyone on 94 westbound? Got a weird one tailing me, need a second pair of eyes." Silence. Then, a burst of static. Faint, like a whisper beneath the white noise. Jason strained to listen. Not alone. His stomach clenched. The voice was barely there, distorted, almost swallowed by the interference. He gritted his teeth. "Say again? Who's out there?" More static. "Don't stop." Jason's grip tightened on the wheel. He wasn't the type to scare easy, but this was starting to feel wrong. The van kept following. Its headlights didn't waver. Its speed didn't change. Jason's gut told him one thing. Keep driving. Jason's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The voice on the radio had been so faint, so distorted, that he wasn't even sure he'd heard it right. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it was, they weren't joking. "Don't stop." His hands tightened on the wheel. He checked his mirrors again. The van was still there. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think rationally. Maybe it was just another trucker messing around. Maybe his radio was picking up a stray signal from some old CB chatter. But deep down he knew better. He'd been on the road for years. He knew when something wasn't right. His foot pressed slightly on the accelerator. The big rig rumbled beneath him, the speedometer creeping up. He wasn't about to play games with some lunatic in a rusted van. If they wanted to follow, they'd have to keep up. The road stretched ahead, empty. No turnoffs, no exits, just miles of asphalt cutting through the darkness. Faster. The truck roared as it picked up speed. 65, 70, 75. Jason glanced at the mirrors again. The van should have been fading into the distance. It wasn't. It was still there, perfectly steady. Not struggling to keep up, not falling behind, just there. Jason's breath came short. That wasn't possible. Not unless... His stomach twisted. He wasn't dealing with something normal. He forced his mind back to reality. Think. There had to be a way to shake it. His headlights illuminated a road sign ahead. Rest stop. 2 miles. That was his chance. Jason eased off the gas, pretending to drive normally. If the van was really following him, they'd have to reveal themselves when he stopped. 1 mile. Half a mile. The turnoff appeared, a lonely parking lot with a single dim streetlight. Jason flicked his signal and pulled in, rolling slowly to a stop. The truck hissed as he set the brakes. Silence. He glanced at the mirror. The van was gone. Jason exhaled. His shoulders sagged with relief. Maybe it had just been his imagination. Maybe the van had finally passed him and... Then something moved. Not ahead of him. Behind him. Jason's stomach turned to ice. He didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to drive. Now, don't turn around. Don't check. Just go. But he did. Slowly, carefully, he checked the side mirror. The van was parked directly behind him. No headlights, no engine noise. Just there, silent and waiting. Jason swallowed hard. He reached for the radio with a shaky hand. "Breaker, breaker," he muttered, voice low. "If anyone's listening, I might have a situation here." Static, then a click, like someone had just picked up. Jason held his breath. A whisper crawled through the radio. "Don't open your door." His blood ran cold. A soft thump echoed outside. Something had just touched his truck. Jason's fingers hovered over the ignition. His breath was shallow, his pulse hammering. The van's doors were closed. No one had gotten out. But something was there. He didn't wait. The engine roared as he shoved the truck into gear, tires screeching against the pavement as he gunned it back onto the highway. The massive rig shook as it hit full speed, roaring down the road. His heart pounded. His hands were slick on the wheel, but he didn't care. He wasn't stopping again. Not for anything. Jason's breathing was ragged, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His truck roared back onto the highway, the massive engine growling beneath him as he pushed it faster, harder. He didn't dare check the mirrors. He didn't need to. He knew the van was still there. The road ahead stretched endlessly, dark and empty. The occasional road sign flickered in his headlights, but he barely registered them. His mind was stuck on what had just happened. That voice, that thing outside his truck. His radio remained silent now. No whispers, no static, just dead air. Jason reached for his coffee, his hands still shaking. He took a sip, hoping the familiar bitterness would ground him. Then his lights caught something up ahead. A figure, standing in the middle of the highway. Jason's heart slammed into his ribs. He barely had time to react. The figure wasn't moving. He slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed against the asphalt, the truck shuddering violently as it skidded forward. For a split second, Jason saw the figure clearly. A man, or what looked like a man. He was tall, impossibly thin, wearing clothes so old and tattered they barely clung to his body. His face was shadowed, but Jason saw something in his eyes. Emptiness. And then, the truck passed right through him. Jason's breath hitched, his chest tightened as the rig finally rolled to a stop. He sat frozen, gripping the wheel, his lungs fighting for air. No body, no impact, nothing. He whipped around, scanning the road behind him. The figure was gone, but the van? It was still there. Closer now. Too close. Its headlights flickered once, dim and sickly yellow. Then they cut out completely. Jason's hands trembled. His mind screamed at him to keep driving, but something was wrong. The van wasn't just following him anymore. It was waiting. His mouth was dry as he reached for the radio again. "Anyone out there?" His voice was hoarse. "Got a situation, Highway 94, westbound. I need a response." Silence. Then a slow, distant click. Jason's stomach churned. Static crackled over the line. "You're going the wrong way." His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't any voice he recognized. It was his own. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. "Who the hell is this?" More static. A long, eerie pause. Then, "Look behind you." His entire body locked up. He didn't want to. He really didn't want to. But his hands moved on their own, shaking as they adjusted the side mirror. The van's doors were open, and something was standing beside it. Something tall, something thin. Jason's vision blurred. His breath came in short gasps. He had to go. Now his foot stomped the pedal and the truck lurched forward. The engine roared as he sped down the highway, pushing faster, harder. The mirrors rattled from the force. He checked again. The van wasn't following anymore, but the thing that had stepped out of it, it was closer. Jason's foot was a lead weight on the accelerator. The truck groaned under the pressure, the speedometer creeping past 80, then 85. He didn't care. He needed distance. He needed to get away from whatever had just stepped out of that van. His breathing was sharp, ragged. His chest felt tight. He risked another glance at the mirrors. It was gone. His stomach twisted. Not farther away, not chasing him. Just gone. Jason swallowed hard, forcing his hands to steady on the wheel. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he saw. The figure, the van, the doors hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow something whole. But now, the road behind him was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching for miles. Jason exhaled, long and shaky. All right, he muttered, trying to convince himself he was still in control, that he was still in reality. He grabbed the radio again. Breaker. Anyone rolling westbound on 94, you got eyes on that white van?" Silence. Static. Then, "No van." Jason stiffened. The voice was clear this time. Male. Gravelly, like someone who had spent too many years smoking and too many nights behind the wheel. "You sure?" Jason asked, gripping the radio. "Old thing. Rusted out. Been tailing me for miles. Someone had to see it." A long pause. "Ain't no van driver." Jason's fingers curled tighter around the mic. "Then what the hell was I looking at?" Another pause, this one longer. He could hear the faint crackle of someone breathing on the other end. Then, finally, "You need to get off that road." Jason's skin prickled. "What?" A click. The line went dead. Jason cursed under his breath. The truck rattled as it hit a slight dip in the road, shaking the radio in its cradle. He shoved it back into place, licking his lips. His mouth was dry as sand. He checked his GPS. The next exit was another 20 miles out. His mind spun. What the hell did that guy mean? Get off the road? He wasn't about to take advice from some faceless voice over the CB, but something was wrong. He could feel it. The road felt longer than it should. The mile markers weren't making sense. He passed exit 223. Then, 10 minutes later, exit 223 again. His breath hitched. That wasn't possible. He hadn't turned around. The highway was a straight shot west. He should have passed the next exit by now. Jason clenched his jaw, forcing his eyes back on the road. His headlights stretched far ahead, revealing nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional sign. Then, The van was back, right in front of him. Jason's stomach dropped. It hadn't been there a second ago. There was no turnoff, no place for it to come from. It had just appeared, dead center of the highway. Its brake lights were out. The rear doors hung slightly open. Jason's pulse thundered. There was something inside, something waiting. The truck was closing in fast. He yanked the wheel hard to the left, the tires screaming as he veered into the opposite lane. The weight of the rig threatened to tip, but he kept control, narrowly missing the van as he tore past it. His mirrors rattled from the force. He gasped for breath, knuckles aching from how tight he gripped the wheel. He risked one last glance. The van didn't move. It just sat there, waiting. Then, in the faint glow of his taillights, the doors swung open wider. Jason didn't stick around to see what came out. He floored it. The highway stretched ahead, a long, dark ribbon cutting through the night. But he wasn't alone. And he wasn't sure if he ever had been. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath was shallow, coming in sharp bursts as he forced himself to focus on the road. The truck was still moving. That was all that mattered. The van, the thing inside it. Whatever was happening tonight, he didn't care. He just needed to get out of here. His hands were clammy on the wheel. He risked another glance at the mirror. The highway stretched behind him, dark and empty. No van, no figure, nothing. But he didn't trust it. His GPS flickered, the screen distorting for a brief moment before resetting. 19 miles to the next exit. Jason exhaled. Keep driving, just keep driving. Then, his headlights caught something up ahead, another vehicle. He almost laughed in relief. It was a semi, just like his, rolling steady in the right lane. Jason flipped his turn signal and eased into the left lane, pulling alongside the other truck. He turned his head, ready to nod at the driver, maybe even ask if they'd seen the van. But the cab was empty. His chest seized. No driver, no movement. Just an empty rig rolling perfectly straight down the highway. Jason's hands shook. He tightened his grip on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Number. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. His truck roared forward, leaving the phantom semi behind. The radio crackled. Jason nearly jumped out of his skin. Still going the wrong way. The voice was his. Distorted, hollow, like someone had recorded him speaking and played it back just slightly off. His throat was tight. He didn't respond. His headlights hit another road sign. Exit 223. 2 miles. Jason's stomach turned. No, he passed this already. Twice. His hands trembled. He checked the fuel gauge. It was full. Impossible. He'd been driving for hours. He should be halfway to empty by now. His skin felt cold, like something was pressing against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His mind spun. Had he ever left that rest stop? Had he ever been driving at all? His radio clicked on again. Stop the truck. Jason's jaw clenched. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Not a chance. The voice on the radio sighed. Then, the headlights flickered. The truck lurched. Jason's stomach dropped. The engine coughed, sputtering like it was choking. The dashboard lights flickered wildly, the speedometer dropping. The truck was slowing down. His hands flew to the controls, flicking switches, turning the ignition. Nothing worked. The radio crackled. You don't have a choice. Jason's breath came fast and uneven. The truck rolled to a stop right in the middle of the highway. His headlights cut out. For the first time all night, everything went completely dark. Jason sat frozen in the pitch-black cab, his breath shallow, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The truck was dead. No engine, no lights, no power, only silence. A thick, suffocating silence. His fingers shook as he reached for the ignition, twisting it hard. Click, click, nothing. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His radio was still on, but all he could hear was a low, steady static. Then, a sound. A slow, deliberate tap against his driver's side door. Jason's entire body went rigid. Another tap, then another, like knuckles against metal. He didn't move, didn't breathe. His fingers hovered over the door lock, even though he already knew it was shut. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched around him like a heavy fog. Then, something scraped along the side of the cab. A long, slow, dragging sound, like fingernails. Jason clenched his jaw, forcing himself to not look. He would not look. His radio crackled again. Open the door. His stomach turned. Number Jason's breath was sharp, ragged. His hands gripped the wheel like a lifeline. Then something moved in his mirror. He didn't want to see, but he couldn't stop himself. His eyes flicked toward the glass. The van was right there. Not behind him, not down the highway. Beside him, right next to his truck, where it shouldn't be. And standing next to it was him. Jason felt the air leave his lungs, a perfect copy of himself. Same jacket, same hands, same tired, terrified face, except its mouth was wrong, stretched too wide. A grin that wasn't human. Jason's doppelganger raised a hand and knocked on the window. Jason jerked back, his spine pressed against the seat. His chest was too tight to breathe. The thing tilted its head, knocked again. This time its mouth moved. Jason heard the words inside his own skull. Let me in. Jason's entire body screamed at him to run, to wake up, to move. His shaking hands reached for the ignition. One last try, one last desperate chance. The engine roared to life. Jason slammed the gas. His tires screeched against the asphalt as the truck lurched forward. The mirrors rattled from the force, but he didn't care. He wasn't stopping again. Not now. Not ever. His foot stayed glued to the pedal. His eyes locked on the highway ahead. The road stretched forward, endless and empty, but he didn't look back. He didn't dare look back, because he knew. If he did, the van would still be there. The truck roared down the highway, engine screaming as Jason pushed it past every limit. The speedometer needle trembled, but he didn't dare slow down. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could still feel it. That thing. His own face staring back at him through the mirror. The words still echoed inside his skull. Let me in. Hell no. Jason gritted his teeth, his hands aching from how tightly he gripped the wheel. He forced himself to keep his eyes on the road, to focus on reality. Exit 223-1 mile. He swallowed hard. If this was another loop, he was screwed. But if it was real, if he could just get off this cursed highway. A flash in the mirror. Jason's gut clenched. Don't look. Don't look. But his body betrayed him. His gaze flicked up. The van was behind him again, closer this time, and this time, the driver's seat wasn't empty. Something was inside. Jason couldn't make out a face, but he could feel it watching. His throat tightened. His foot pressed the gas harder, the truck roaring forward. Almost there, almost to the exit. The ramp came into view, stretching off to the right. Jason yanked the wheel. The truck veered hard, tires screeching as he flew down the ramp. The weight of the rig nearly tipped, but he kept control, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles burned. The second his tires hit the exit road, his mirrors went black. Jason blinked. The highway behind him was gone, not fading into the distance, not stretching endlessly like before, just gone, like it had never been there. His pulse thundered. His hands trembled on the wheel. His headlights illuminated an empty intersection ahead. A real road, a real place. Streetlights flickered over a gas station, a row of parked cars, the faint neon glow of a diner sign. Jason slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. He sat there, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps, his hands still locked around the wheel. Then, slowly, he reached for the radio, flicked to an open frequency, pressed the mic. Breaker, breaker. His voice was raw, shaky. Anyone out there? A pause. Then, a voice. Clear, crisp, normal. Loud and clear, driver. You all right? Jason nearly laughed. He sagged back in his seat, his head hitting the headrest. The diner's neon sign buzzed outside, casting soft light through the windshield. The real world. He was back. He wiped a hand down his face, swallowing hard before clicking the mic again. "Yeah," he said, voice hoarse. "Yeah, I think I am." Another pause. Then the voice came back, chuckling. "Good to hear, man. You had us worried for a second. Sounded like you were talking to yourself for a while." Jason froze. The air turned to ice. His fingers clenched around the mic. "What?" The radio crackled. "Yeah, man. Last 30 minutes, just static and you mumbling. Like you were having a conversation." Jason's stomach twisted. His breath came sharp and shallow. He turned, checked the mirrors. The highway was gone. But in the farthest corner of the lot, under a broken streetlight, sat a white van. Its engine was off, its headlights dark, and its doors were slightly open. Jason's fingers loosened from the wheel. His breath slowed. His pulse quieted. He didn't panic. He didn't run. Because deep down, he already knew. No one ever really leaves that road.